ज्ञान ॐ ह्रीं ऋतं तमोचलो गुणजित गुणेभ्यः नाक्तां तेवां सकरुणं तव पादपद्मं मोहं कषं बहुकृतं न भजे जतोऽहम् तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो भक्तिर्भगश्च भजनं भवभेदकारे गच्छन्तलं सुविपुलं गमनाय तत्त्वम् वक्त्रधृतोऽपि हृदये न मे भाति किञ्चित् तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो तेजस्तरोन्ते तरसा त्वयि तृप्तो तृष्णा रागे कृते ऋतपथे त्वयि रामकृष्णे मार्तामृतं तव पदं मरणोर्विनाशं तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो कृत्यं करोति कलुषं कुहकान्तकारे स्नान्तं शिवं सुविमलं तव नाम नाथ यस्मादहं त्वस्मरणो जगदेकगम्य तस्मात्तमेव शरणं मम दीनबन्धो ॐ स्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ नमो श्री भगवते रामकृष्णाय नमो नमः। ॐ सर्वमङ्गलं मङ्गले शिवे सर्वार्थसाधिके शरण्ये त्र्यम्बके गौरी नारायणी नमोस्तुते। सृष्टिस्थिति विनाशाना शक्तिभूते सनातने गुणाश्रये गुणमये नारायणी जय महामाई की जय। जय भगवान श्री रामकृष्ण देव की जय। जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।
नमः श्री अतिराजाय विवेकानंद सूरे सच्चित् सुख स्वरूपाय स्वामिने तापहारिणे. So we had come to this culmination of the philosophical conclusion last time, where it was said everything that has form, everything that calls up an idea in your mind is within Maya, for everything that is bound by the laws of time, space and causation is within Maya. In other words, what he is saying here is that any conceptually bound framework that we have indicates a finger to something that is more fundamental in us, and is necessarily fraught with some kind of contradiction in terms of our existence whenever we try to get at something truly fundamental, or even at a basic concept of truth or fundamental values. One. Second, in terms of our epistemology, in terms of our quest for knowledge, everything is bound within these frameworks which define our existence, namely time, space, and causation. These were the fundamental philosophical aspects that one had reached. Do these have more gut level, tangible ramifications in terms of our so-called practical life? And here he reverts back to the theme from where he started, namely the historical evolution of these notions of infinity, divinity, cosmic law, etc., etc. So he reverts back to that with this philosophical understanding that our attempts at getting at any kind of notion of a fundamental ethical stand or fundamental epistemology, basically in terms of a certain ultimate clarity of understanding ourselves and the world and our place in it, is bound in a framework. I mean, it is bound to lead to certain contradictions. But this is at a certain level only abstract. But it's something that we do experience every time we try to push something to its limit. We come up against a wall. Armed with this idea, armed with this particular bunch of mental experiments that we can perform on ourselves by trying to look at our own foundations, the foundations of our own mind, we see that these contradictions are not something abstract, not something theoretical that just some philosophers have come up with, which have no connection to life. It's basically any time you try to probe anything in life to its limit, there is a certain boundary that we are faced with. Having experienced that, having understood that this is a certain fact of life, certain existential fact, let us go back and investigate the development of religious ideas, the development of these teleological philosophical ideas, and see what those ideas have to say to us today, from our vantage point today. Let us go back a little to those early ideas of God and see what became of them. We perceive at once that the idea of some being who is eternally loving us, eternally unselfish and almighty, ruling this universe, could not satisfy. This notion of might or power on the one hand, and an eternally unselfish, loving God on the other, these two ideas cannot logically coexist. This is the kind of statement that he is making. Why? What leads us to this kind of a conclusion? And he says that next. Where is the just, merciful God? Asked the philosopher. Justice and mercy, I mean, where is it? Does he not see millions and millions of his children perish in the form of men and animals? For who can live one moment here without killing others? Can you draw a breath without destroying thousands of lives? You live because millions die. Every moment of your life Every breath that you breathe is death to thousands. Every movement that you make is death to millions. Every morsel that you eat is death to millions. So which basically saying, what he's saying, he's going to expand on this. Essentially, this notion of mercy and justice that we have, these are very anthropomorphic concepts, very limited by our own understanding both of ourselves and of the very limited worldview that we have. And so we expect, basically, if one believes in a personal God, one expects that personal God to be just and mighty in our terms. One. If one doesn't believe in a personal God, one is expecting the same notions, the world, so to speak, to be just and merciful to us. It is precisely this narrow perspective, focused entirely on ourselves, where we decide that we are going to be the judges of what is powerful and what is merciful. That is what is leading to these contradictions. Say, for example, every bit of food that we take, along with some living being, be it animal, be it plant, be it microbe, is losing its life so that we may live. With every breath, some insects, if they go in, small microbes, they go in, sometimes they die. Which means our life, this consumption of oxygen so that we may live, is accompanied by the death of several microbes around us. One form of life proceeds at the cost of another. So if we were to base things on our narrow ideas of justice and mercy, then the notion of an all-merciful, all-powerful God becomes a meaningless concept. That is where he is headed. Every moment of your life, every breath that you breathe is death to thousands. Every movement that you make is death to millions. Every morsel that you eat is death to millions. Why should they die? And this is the question that comes up. Why? Essentially, why means what is there behind this question, why? There's a certain affront to a certain personal sense of justice and mercy. Assuming that, not examining that, assuming our sense of justice and might and mercy to be sacrosanct, we are expecting the world to subscribe to the same ideas. The way nature behaves is supposed to respect this very narrow anthropomorphic idea of mercy and justice. There is no reason why that should be, except that this is how we feel. And so we expect the world to subscribe to these values that we do not examine. And so when we ask the question why, we are not subjecting ourselves to that enquiry. We are subjecting the world to that enquiry. We are subjecting this notion of a God to that inquiry. But this idea of a God is really born out of these ideas within ourselves. Born out of these ideas of mercy and justice. So we would like to impute these ideas in some magnified sense to a God. But then the injustices, the horrors of the world come up in our consciousness and start fighting with this idea of an all-merciful, all-powerful God. The existence of human suffering, the existence of suffering and pain of other beings, apart from humans, is something that is very real and tangible. How do you make that existential fact of pain and suffering commensurate with an idea of an all-merciful, just God? That is the question that is being asked. In Christian theology, this is called the problem of evil. Various religious ideas have come up, and they have tried to give very piecemeal answers to this question. In some of the Semitic religions, there is a notion of a devil. Yeah. So there is one particular creature, perhaps with horns, perhaps without, that is responsible for all the bad that's there in the world. It doesn't solve the problem. Why doesn't it solve the problem? It doesn't solve the problem because then the power of the devil becomes commensurate with the power of a God. And the God does not remain all-powerful. In other words, mercy and power are in conflict with each other. This is that aspect in the Semitic religions. In the Eastern Oriental religions, the place of the notion of a devil is not there. It's replaced by this idea of karma. Oh, so-and-so's karma is bad, therefore so-and-so is suffering. Well, that makes karma, it's just a word, it's a concept. And so that makes this notion of karma at least as powerful as a God. So again, God's almightiness comes into question. Basically, again, whatever religious explanation you give it, the idea of might or power on the one hand in its ultimate form, and the notion of mercy in its ultimate form, logically contradict each other, given the fact that human suffering is something that impinges on our consciousness as something very real. So long as human beings suffer, this conflict is going to remain. No amount of philosophy, no amount of religious theology is going to solve this problem. That's what he is developing towards. Every morsel that you eat is death to millions. Why should they die? And then he gives a few answers. There is an old sophism that they are very low existences. Supposing they are, which is questionable, for who knows whether the ant is greater than the man or the man than the ant? Who can prove one way or the other? Apart from that question, even taking it for granted that these are very low beings, still why should they die? If they are low, they have more reason to live. Why not? Because they live more in the senses, they feel pleasure and pain 1,000-fold more than you or I can do. Which of us eats a dinner with the same gusto as a dog or wolf? None, because our energies are not in the senses. They are in the intellect, in the spirit. But in animals, their whole soul is in the senses, and they become mad and enjoy things which we human beings never dream of. And the pain is commensurate with the pleasure. Pleasure and pain are meted out in equal measure. If the pleasure felt by animals is so much keener than that felt by man, it follows that the animal's sense of pain is as keen, if not keener, than man's. So the fact is, the pain and misery men feel in dying is intensified 1,000-fold in animals, and yet we kill them without troubling ourselves about their misery. This is Maya. Again, essentially, the notion of ethics that we have, an absence of violence meted out to the world, being a sort of a working definition of mercy or justice, is not commensurate with one's own life. Why? Because every moment we live, there are beings who die so that we may live. In other words, my individual life is at the cost of the lives of others. This is what is being said. So, the notion of ethics that we usually come up with, propagate so that the society that we live in is bound together and sustains us as a species, this notion of ethics is in conflict with something as fundamental as our physical existence. So, one cannot logically maintain one's own existence and simultaneously claim that any supreme notion in our minds of a God has to be ethical. These two ideas, simple physical day-to-day existence on the one hand, and ethics on the other, they are not in any ultimate sense compatible. You cannot come up with an idea which will make sure that an ethical standard is going to be universal and is not going to afflict other beings, perhaps human beings, perhaps others. And this again is a manifestation of this contradictions here, ethical versus existential, which define our day-to-day lives. So, previously he had come up with these philosophical ideas which basically came to this epistemological question about whether one can gain some kind of an ultimate knowledge about us, our place in the universe and the universe itself, and basically came to the conclusion that any idea that comes up is within a domain which is fraught with contradictions, because space-time and causation do form the matrix, the substratum of all our thought, of all our ideas. Here, what is being done is that moving from epistemology to ethics, one is basically asking this question: how can one possibly believe in a God that is both almighty and all-merciful. And it's basically coming to the conclusion that these two qualities are in conflict with each other. And coming down to brass tacks, it's basically saying that my own existence right here, right now, is in conflict with any completely universal idea of mercy. Because my existence right now means I have to breathe. With every breath, certain microbes are going in and dying. And there is no resolution of this. And if we suppose there is a personal God like a human being who made everything, these so-called explanations and theories which try to prove that out of evil comes good are not sufficient. Let 20,000 good things come, but why should they come from evil? On that principle, I might cut the throats of others because I want the full pleasure of my five senses. That is no reason. Why should good come through evil? The question remains to be answered, and it cannot be answered. The philosophy of India was compelled to admit this. This basic philosophical question of the problem of evil, whichever way you want to formulate it, whether you call this opposing forces of ideals and idealism, whether you want to call it a devil, whether you want to call it karma, whatever, whether you want to call it maya, it really doesn't matter what epithet you give it. The fact remains that all mercy and all might as human concepts are in conflict with each other. And so if you impute these to a personal God, then that God is either not all merciful or not all powerful. This remains. This conflict remains. So how do we address it? And in order to address it, we'll have to ask ourselves, where does this question originate? What is the substance? I had mentioned this at the beginning of today's discussion, that it really originates in our assumption of these ideas of mercy and might existing within ourselves. A notion of ethics, good and bad, very anthropocentric, very centered in this little species called Homo sapiens, of a particular leaning. People who have thought about these problems for a while and live in particular societies. Ethics born of those. And judging others on the basis of these unexamined values that we take as sacrosanct. It is these ideas, it is here that this conflict originates. It's not outside. This notion of might is something that is a subjective notion. It is we who think of certain things as very powerful. Say the forces of nature. We regard these as very powerful, and being human beings, we naturally tend to associate a conscious force behind these things. Why? It's not that the consciousness is sort of outside. It is our consciousness that is reflecting that power. And so we regard some of this stuff as very powerful. Say a landslide in the mountains. Do we attribute any ethical responsibility to the mountain for shedding its weight and resulting maybe in deaths of millions. Do we do that? Do we say, oh, that's a very bad mountain, it's an evil mountain, put it in jail? Makes no sense, right? We do at such instances regard natural forces as natural forces. But since we can't do anything about the mountain, we start imputing various other kinds of forces, call it the devil, call it somebody's bad karma. These are not explanations. These are merely stories we tell ourselves, basically because we are unwilling to examine in our own hearts where this moral sense comes from. How sacrosanct is it? How true is it? How unquestionable is it? And once we ask that question, then the question becomes, where in us does this notion of ethics come from? Where in our subjective constitution is the ethical sense hidden? So, instead of becoming an inquiry into the objective universe, it starts becoming an inquiry into ourselves. Why would we expect? And then the question, if it's posed in a slightly different way, then it becomes almost obvious what the answer should be. Why should we expect this huge world, this vast universe, to subscribe to this very petty personal sense of ethics? Why? There's no reason for that. That is the assumption that gets challenged. And it is on the basis of this assumption, without challenging it, without inquiring of it, that these notions of a God and a devil, of a God versus karma, all these conflicts arise. But once we ask ourselves, is there any reason why I should take this belief that I have for granted and start judging everything else in the world on the basis of this petty notion, then the smallness of that belief system gets showed up for what it is. It's not large enough to encompass the world, which means we shed this prejudice. This subjective prejudice, which we thought was something sacrosanct, now becomes something that can be questioned. And once you question that, then the foundation of these philosophical enquiries of the problem of evil become exposed. The problem of evil in the external world is not any longer a problem. What is the problem? The problem is that we as human beings are accustomed to thinking in terms of these polar opposites, in terms of this is good and this is bad, in terms of this is powerful and this is weak, in terms of all these dual pairs. The examination of the external world now converts itself into a subjective inquiry into the foundations of our subjective ethics, and then we start seeing that there is no reason for that to be regarded as absolute and sacrosanct. That once it's challenged, the path to further and deeper subjective inquiry opens up. And here he says, the Vedanta was and is the boldest system of religion. It stopped nowhere. He's going to give a little bit about the social circumstances that led to it. We'll read this and then stop and then come back, not next week, because next week I will not be here, week after that. It stopped nowhere and it had one advantage. There was no body of priests who sought to suppress every man who tried to tell the truth. There was always absolute religious freedom. In India, the bondage of superstition is a social one. Here in the West, society is very free. Social matters in India are very strict, but religious opinion is free. In England, a man may dress any way he likes or eat what he likes. No one objects. But if he misses attending church, this is about 1900, so that's how the society was at that time. If he misses church, then Mrs. Grundy is down on him. He has to conform first to what society says on religion, and then he may think of the truth. In India, on the other hand, if a man dines with one who does not belong to his own caste, down comes society with all its terrible powers and crushes him then and there. If he wants to dress a little differently from the way in which his ancestor dressed ages ago, he is done for. I have heard of a man who was cast out by society because he went several miles to see the first railway train. Well, we shall presume that was not true. He's basically commenting on this aspect of religious freedom coupled with social conservatism that existed then in India, still exists. And that situation is the complete opposite in the West. Religious opinion has not, or ideas have not developed that much. On the other hand, society is rather free. So this is, he's comparing and contrasting these two societies. But in religion, and here he is talking of religious freedom, we find atheists, materialists and Buddhists, creeds, opinions and speculations of every phase and variety, some of a most startling character, living side by side. Preachers of all sects go about preaching and getting adherents. And at the very gates of the temples of gods, the Brahmins, to their credit be it said, allow even the materialists to stand and give forth their opinions. Here, he's basically setting the ground in terms of societal norms and religious freedom. Societal conservatism at the level of society coupled with freedom of religious thought that, for a while at least, perhaps even today, defines Indian society. It is this freedom, the religious freedom, which gave rise to these deep thinkers who could investigate, analyze, and come to certain conclusions. Not resolutions of these problem of evil, not a resolution of the problem of a God versus a devil, of a God versus karma, but an investigation into the matrix which gives rise to these thoughts. We'll take that up week after next. Okay. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Tat Sat. Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.